Hello, I'm Tom Parker and welcome to Voices from the CEPS Ideas Lab. In this episode, I spoke with Stefaan Verhulst. Stefaan is co-founder and Chief Research and Development Officer of GovLab, NYU's governance laboratory. During our interview, we discussed how question science can refine policymaking, address systematic biases, and foster a more intelligent approach to AI-driven research and innovation. I hope you enjoy the episode. Well, Stefaan, pleasure to have you here.
Pleasure. Thank you for having me.
What inspired the development of a new science and taxonomy of questions, and why is it particularly important for advancing women's health innovation?
Yeah, so for the last few years, I've been working on how do we make policy making more data-driven. And that means that we need data in order to really understand what is the problem and how do we then start addressing it and measuring whether we are making any progress as such. Now, the real challenge is that we do have data. We do need a lot more data that is made accessible, but quite often the problem is that we don't really know what is the question that actually matters. And so I became very frustrated over the years by really working on data, and everyone wants more data. But when I asked, great, we need more data, but what's the question you seek to answer? Quite often I got a lot of blank stares and people not really able to formulate a question, or worse, indicating that give us the data and we will formulate the question afterwards. And I don't think that's the best way forward, which is why I started this initiative called the 100 Questions Initiative, which is what are the 100 questions that matter to society that we could answer if we find a way to unlock the data that is already collected in ways that is responsible. And by doing that work, I came to the realization that as a society, we are extremely unsophisticated when it comes to formulating questions. We have data science, but we have no question science. We actually have no standard methodology that is rigorous and also takes into account diverse perspectives in a way that then could formulate and prioritize the questions that matter. And that's when I started working on the proposition and the big idea that we actually need question science to complement data science, because without it, we will actually not generate the insights that we can generate, and we will be distracted by all the data as opposed to get a clear signal of that data that matters.
Well, now I'm worried about the next question I'm going to ask, because I haven't been a part of any sort of question science.
Yeah, let's see what your questions actually matches the expectations here.
Well, you've got high expectations, so it's got to be an amazing question. I actually want to look at the challenges and some of the gaps in women's health research and policy. Could you outline some of those? Because then how does this new structured way of formulating and prioritizing questions work in addressing those?
Great, thanks for that question. And so, women's health is one of the domains where we're looking into how do we establish kind of the core questions as it relates to women's health. And it's fundamentally important because women's health typically already starts from some kind of a disadvantage, because many of the questions in health don't take women's health into account. And so for that reason, formulating the questions that matter in women's health is also kind of a recalibration of what are the questions that matter in health that have different implications for women as a result of their kind of unique characteristics and experiences in life. So that's one way. The other way is that the other reason why question science matter is because a lot of question science also deals with questions equity, by which I mean who actually formulates the questions matters with regard to what are the topics that one will pay attention to. And it turns out in women's health, many of the questions are not formulated by women or by kind of those that have that are affected in different ways. And so question science is also a way to provide questions equity, in addition to unpacking a complex topic like women's health in a far more sophisticated way and in a way that provides kind of prioritization as well.
But there's bias that must be built in already in lots of different areas around health. You know, if we're looking at the context of models in AI that have been built,
Yeah.
you know, there are inherent biases on the information and data that has been made available beforehand.
Yeah.
So this isn't a sort of specific problem within women's health as well, although important to highlight those areas. Is it affecting other areas?
So rightly so, and part of the bias is because we start with the data.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah,
so a lot of the data that has been collected that is then being reused for other purposes and other questions is already biased in itself.
Yeah.
And as a result, we actually establish more bias. If we would start with a question, right?
Yeah.
And say, what are the questions that matters for different groups and what is the implications if we don't answer them, then you would actually know what is the quality of the data that we have, and you would also know what are the gaps in data that we have in order to actually start answering that question. And so yes, so it's not uniquely to women's health, it's also to other parts of health, but other parts of society as well, that certain groups, A, never get asked what is the question that matters to you, and B, certain groups automatically get ignored because they start from data that is being collected from groups that are, anyway, data rich, right? So for instance, one of the big areas that I have worked on is accessing private sector data, like for instance, social media data to inform public interest questions. Now, unfortunately, not everyone is on social media, right? Which means that the questions we can answer from social media data are limited if we start with the data, right? But if we would start with a question, then social media data might be useful, but needs to be complemented with other data sets as well.
It's essentially about diversifying the stakeholders within any part of this, correct?
Diversifying the stakeholders, and it's also about empowering stakeholders that typically are not part of the question cycle in ways that actually recalibrates some of the priorities as well.
And how is AI going to change science in the coming years? It's a big question, but with some of the areas that you're looking at now, having this question science and looking at why data might be biased, how is AI going to change science in the coming years if these areas aren't looked at, but perhaps as a whole?
Yeah, well, meaning I think AI is going to totally transform the scientific enterprise, both in good and potentially bad ways, right? So the scientific enterprise basically has a set of stages, right? Which is about formulating the question.
Yeah.
Then it's about, anyway, what data do we need in order to test the premises that we basically set out to test, to then subsequently publication and then testing and reproduction of the results. And so from my point of view, AI has a potential role to play at every stage and could change the way we go about formulating premises. It could change the way we go about actually testing some of those premises in much more faster ways and different ways than we ever had. But from my point of view, what is still very unique is the who determines the question, right? And I think that's still where human intelligence plays a more important role than AI, because humans can take context into account much better than AI can. AI is just reacting to what it's fed, not the context in which the question is formulated. And it is also not good in actually prioritizing in alignment with certain kinds of values as well, because AI could start producing answers to all kinds of offensive questions that we actually don't want to be posed as well. And so I think human intelligence will remain important when it comes to the question formulation, and we will have to become more rigorous and more sophisticated in how we formulate those questions, because the whole machinery is set up to spew answers, right? But are those answers actually any meaningful if we don't spend enough time on actually really thinking what's the question and how do we formulate that question to a large extent?
And when you talk about the interaction of human intelligence, you discuss with me a little bit about the difference between the individual and collective intelligence when it comes to that human game.
Yeah, and so again, other part of my work has been on collective intelligence, and I do think that actually AI has a huge potential to improve collective intelligence as well.
Yeah.
But I think what we need to do is not just individual intelligence only speaks about one particular context experience, right? And so collective intelligence is much more sophisticated in different contexts, different lived experiences, so that you actually can tap into this kind of collective understanding of what the problem is from my point of view a much better way to go about it, and also a better way to prioritize, right? As opposed to kind of what happens quite often in the current scientific enterprise, which is an individual researcher that determines this is the question that matters, without actually having a collective understanding of whether that really matters. Now, that does not mean that we can have experimentation, does not mean that we can have pluralism in certain kind of questions, but for certain questions, we actually do need to prioritize them because resources are scarce, getting more scarcer, and especially we need to do this in a responsible way vis-a-vis kind of the community that we seek to serve.
I wanted to go down the route of how humans are interacting with AI and how there have been people that are scared about displacement of their current skill set and jobs by AI. This sounds very much like you are talking about creating a collective with AI, the importance of the human within the relationship. And actually, have you got examples from history and technological revolutions whereby man and machine, for want of a better phrase, have worked much better with each other than they have previously predicted?
So the fundamental question quite often with technology is that will it replace or will it augment human intelligence, right? And I think to a large extent AI, when designed well, has huge potential for augmentation of human intelligence, right? For instance, again, to questions, we actually can start using AI to see are the questions already answered, right? Because the amount of sheer waste in the system where we actually start answering questions that already have had an answer, right, is stunning to me, to be quite honest, right? I mean, part of the problem in human society is that we actually forget quite often, right, what we already know, right? Now, AI can enable us to really think about, actually, we already know that, so what's the next question? Because the interesting thing about questions, which I forgot to say perhaps, is the first part of the word. It is a quest, right? And so the question is, how do you organize the quest in ways that actually improves society, right? I call this architecting inquiry, where you need to architect inquiry. And quite often we do this, at the current environment, we do it poorly because we don't know what's the question that really needs answering versus the question that is already answered, or how do we really test out certain kinds of questions in a much more faster way so that we know what's the next question that really matters. And so that's kind of a very nerdy answer to your question.
No, but I love it. We're all about the nerdiness. Well, look, it's been an absolute pleasure to speak with you today, Stefaan. And
thank you for having me.
I'll watch this space with much interest.
Sure. Thank you.
Take care.
Really good questions.
Thank you.